sure, can everybody make Okay, I'm just going to check about people's videos being off, but I'm sure they are. So this evening's talk, Tropical Plants for Families in London, is being given by Daniel Cahen. He's a botanist who has been working at the herbarium at Kew since 2016, where his role is to identify and curate voucher specimens for the Millennium Seed Bank. His taxonomic research focuses on the buckthorn family, and he has published revisions and describes several new species in that family. He's contributed to publications including the Temperate Plant Family's Identification Handbook and the Herbarium Handbook. He regularly participates in LNHS botany field meetings, and he is a prolific recorder on iNaturalist as well. His work at the herbarium has introduced him to tropical plant diversity, and his knowledge of both tropical and temperate plants has inspired him to give this evening's talk, which we're delighted that he's here to join us. So I'm going to stop my screen share now, and I'm going to hand over to Daniel.
Yeah. There we go. Share screen. Is that looking all right? Okay.
Yeah, that's great.
Excellent. Well, hi everyone. Well, thank you very much for joining. Had a lot of fun preparing this talk, and hopefully some of this will be a bit infectious. So the idea is here is to find out if the tropics are closer than we think, not geographically, of course, but botanically. And we'll discover how many plant families typically associated with lush rainforests and sun-drenched savannas have found a way to thrive right here in London. So the tropics are the region of the Earth's surface located between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn. So those are the two parallels that mark the highest latitudes at which the sun can pass directly overhead. And within this zone, there are three primary climate types that are identified based on the precipitation levels and patterns of precipitation. So we have the tropical rainforests where it rains pretty much all year. There's no dry season. Then we've got the monsoon, tropical monsoon climate where there is a dry season with and typically a heavy rain season. And then there's the tropical savanna climate where there's more extended periods of drought and a lighter rain season. So what explains these patterns is that the sun's intense heating at the equator causes warm, moist air to rise, creating tropical rainforests when this moist air condensates and rains. And then this air moves towards the poles, cools because it's at a high elevation, then descends around 30 degrees latitude north and south. And the circulation pattern called the Hadley cell results in high pressure zones with dry, warm air that's descending, leading to savannas and deserts in these regions. So this process explains the distribution of these climate zones I just mentioned. So in the tropics, we can sort of determine two very broad biomes or biological communities. Where it's wetter, there's the tropical wet rainforest. So this is usually what we associate with the tropics. And these forests are, one of their main characteristics is that there's a very dense closed canopy where the majority of the biological activity is occurring. And that's one of the most biologically productive ecosystems anywhere on Earth. And one key difference between tropical and temperate forests is the abundance of epiphytes, so plants that grow on other plants, usually trees, without being parasitic. So here you have an example in the pineapple family. And another key difference is the abundance of climbing plants, because there's a sort of a mad race to reach the sunlight in the canopy because plants grow so quickly. And in the tropics, climbers account for up to a quarter of all the tropical forest species, which is about 5 times more than in temperate forests. Yeah, and usually the flowers are high up in the canopy, so it makes them hard to collect and study. And categorizing plants is not always straightforward. Like in this case, we have an epiphyte that's also climbing. It's not rooted in the ground, so it's not a proper climber. And we also have cases where a plant can be a shrub in certain conditions or a climber in other conditions or sort of in between. So it's not always clear cut. And just so this plant, this picture, the plant in this picture is native to the Philippines and Sulawesi, and it's notable for these large purple dome-shaped leaves, which can reach about 25 centimeters in diameter and provide shelter to ants colonies. And many large trees in the tropics have these wide flaring roots at the base that we call buttress roots, and they provide extra support in shallow, nutrient-poor soils. And one such tree that has these buttress roots is this very tall tree, Compassia excelsa, which is what we call emergent trees. So those are trees that rise above the canopy layer of the forest. And so some Compassia trees have been measured to reach over 85 meters in height. And because they're above the canopy, they can use the wind to disperse their fruits. Like most plants in the canopy, I mean, a lot of them are dispersed by birds, but for emergent trees, there's that possibility to use wind. And the last trait I'll mention is cauliflory. So that's when flowers and fruits grow directly on the trunks and the large branches, so not on the new growth or twigs. And this adaptation provides mechanical support for large fruits. So think jackfruit or durian, but also allows easier access for non-flying pollinators and dispersers like primates or yeah, for example. So that was the tropical rainforest. And the second very broad category is the savanna, or the dry shrublands. So this is where there's less precipitation, there's an extended period of drought. And there are adaptations there as well. So we're all familiar with the African savanna. In this case, there's no continuous closed canopy, but it's more, there's different layers. There's usually a lot of a grass layer combined with a shrub and tree layer, and different combination of this. Some adaptations include underground storage for plants, or the presence of thorns and spines as a protection against herbivores, and also often a thick trunk as a protection against fire. So this is where we find iconic trees like the baobab and also the acacias. So the thick trunk of the baobab helps store water for periods of drought. But savannas also occur in the Americas. So the most famous example is the Cerrado in Brazil, which has a more continuous grass layer than what we generally associate with the African savanna. And the tree we see here is the sandpaper tree, which is a common tree in American savannas, both in South America and Central America. So now that I've introduced the tropics, I'll move to the main focus of this talk, which is to answer the question in the slide. So that's what mostly tropical plant families naturally self-propagate in London. Another way to phrase this is which predominantly tropical plant families are successfully self-propagating in London's outdoor environment. So this would include both native species and introduced species that have established and are potentially self-sustaining. And a secondary question I'll try to address is how these plant families contribute to the overall plant diversity in London. So to address these questions, I primarily used two data sets, one that's global and one that's specific to London. So for the global data set, to determine which plant families can be classified as predominantly tropical, I used a massive data set called the World Checklist of Vascular Plants, which is freely available. It's public. It's available on Kew's Plants of the World online website. So the checklist is like a working, the World Checklist is a working list of accepted plant names and their synonyms. So any name that's been scientifically published should be included. And it's a massive list that has started in 1988 and contains over 1.4 million plant names. So that includes synonyms. They're not individual species. So after downloading the list, I filtered it to only include accepted names at the species level. And that reduced it to 360,000 species belonging to 456 vascular plant families. However, there are an additional 38,000 names that are awaiting resolution, which I did not include in the analysis. So the total number of known plant species in the world is likely closer to 400,000. And to put the British flora in this context, there are about 3.2 thousand native plant species in Britain, if we include hybrids and microspecies in Hieracium and Rubus. And that includes approximately 900 that occur in Greater London. So this represents less than 1% of global plant diversity. However, in Britain, there's 113 native vascular plant families, and I mentioned there are 456 overall. So that's roughly a quarter of all plant families worldwide. And I counted that there are 98 in London. So London has a good representation of the overall British flora in terms of plant families. So this global data set includes a climate descriptor for the majority of the listed species, and these climate descriptors served as the basis for my analysis to determine how tropical each plant family is. So after querying the list, I created a table that looked a bit like this, from which I could calculate the percentage of species in each family that's tropical, subtropical, temperate, which makes it easier to compare families. So, and I considered tropical what in the checklist was in the categories wet tropical, seasonally dry tropical, montane tropical, or subtropical and tropical. And for London, I initially began by assembling a combined vice county list using British Society of Britain and Ireland's data, but this includes significant areas outside of Greater London. So I contacted Mark Spencer, that many of you know, who's the vice county recorder for Middlesex and is a very prolific botanist in London. And he kindly shared a work in progress checklist for London that he's been compiling with Paul Loss. And this also indicates whether their species are native or introduced in Greater London. So I used that for my analysis. Well, yeah. So this required a little bit of work to match family names between data sets, and also I made the decision to only include species that have been recorded in Greater London since 2010, not to include extinct species or things that haven't been seen for a while as self-propagating. So eventually I was able to use a final list of plants for Greater London that looked a bit like this for my analysis. So with the family, the species, the status, so whether it's native or introduced, and when it was last recorded. So please note that the data I used is not always, can't always be entirely accurate. I mean, the World Checklist contains over 1.4 million plant names, and some of the information regarding distribution may not be up to date. And also determining whether certain plants are native or introduced in London is often challenging. And not all records for London's are necessarily verified or vouchered, so there may be some errors. And also the method I showed to determine the percentage of tropical species is a bit coarse. So in short, take these results with a grain of salt, but they should provide a good overall picture and hopefully capture the gist of things accurately. So to begin with, I'll focus on plants that are native to London. And the families will be presented in descending order based on the proportion of their species that grow in the tropics. So let's say a plant family has 1,000 species. If 900 are only found in the tropics, then I'll say this family is 90% tropical. And this is what I'll use as a proxy for how tropical a plant family is. So the family that came out on top for London as the most tropical of all plant families native to London is the arum family. So only 7% of its species are native outside the tropics. So like the massive leaves in the picture were photographed in Oaxaca, Mexico. And it's a species distributed across Central America. And it's a family that includes many plants with starchy edible tubers, including taro. It's also the family that has the Titan arum, which is native to Sumatra. And it's a common attraction in botanical gardens worldwide. It has the largest unbranched inflorescence of all plants, and it smells of rotting flesh to attract flies, which pollinate the flowers. It's also a plant family of many popular indoor plants, including anthuriums, which is the largest genus in the family with over 1.3 thousand species. And this particular one is native to Colombia, and it's cultivated but not easy to grow. And plants in the arum family are predominantly climbers. There's all kinds of habits of plants in the family, but the most well represented habit is the climbing one. So this is another group that we're familiar with as indoor plants, house plants. Those are usually epiphytes, and they have these characteristic holes in the leaves that are called fenestrations. And the hypothesis of how they evolved to present these is that it might help distribute light to lower leaves. It might help with wind resistance because the leaves are so big, or maybe it acts as a deterrent for herbivores because it looks like the leaves have been munched on. So in London, there are just five native species in the arum family. There's Lords and Ladies, which has the characteristic arum family inflorescence, which has this sort of leafy spathe that encloses this brown spadix. And this brown spadix often generates heat, which can help volatilize sense compounds to attract pollinators. And then we have the duckweeds. So the duckweeds used to be placed in their own separate family, but now they're in a subfamily within the arum family. So there are 4 species of duckweeds that are considered to be native to London, but all of them are widely distributed globally. So duckweeds are free-floating aquatic plants found in slow-moving bodies of fresh water. And they obviously don't have the spathe and spadix inflorescence type of the family. But it is interesting to note that the arum family exhibits such a remarkable range in size. So it contains both the largest unbranched inflorescence with the Titan arum, but also the smallest known of all flowering plant flowers with Wolffia, which is a mere 0.3 millimeters long. So this image shows fat duckweed. The species name gibba means humped, and that describes the air pockets that help the plant to float. So like other duckweeds, it lacks a conventional stem or leaves, and instead it's a floating photosynthetic structure, which is called a frond, but has nothing, which is not homologous to the fern frond. The second duckweed species that's native to London is common duckweed, which is the most recorded one. And they're often dispersed by adhering to the surface of waterfowl like ducks or amphibians like in this photo. Third species is ivy-leaf duckweed, and where the fronds cohere in branched chains. So that makes it easier, that helps identify it. Then there's greater duckweed, which has more numerous roots, and that's what the species name polyrhiza means, many roots. So this is the 17th largest plant family overall with 4.5 thousand species. And while there are just 5 native species in London, there's many other introduced ones like skunk cabbage, for example. So the second most tropical family in London would be the orchids, with 86% of the species occurring just in the tropics. And it's a family of predominantly epiphytic plants, and you mostly find them in the wet tropics, not in savannas. So the plant in this picture is a critically endangered species from Borneo with petals that can measure up to 1 meter. This is a much smaller one, a much smaller orchid flower in the genus Lepanthes and from Costa Rica. Lepanthes means scaled flower. The genus is endemic to the Americas. Here's a second Lepanthes species where you can better see how small the flowers are, but this one has spectacular leaves and was photographed in Ecuador. And here's another one from Ecuador, an epiphyte, has a showy spotted calyx. So the visible part there are the sepals, and at the bottom there's 2 tail-like extensions, and the corolla, so the petals, is very reduced. So orchids have an astounding diversity, and they've attracted a lot of interest, and so much so that the terms orchid delirium or orchidomania or orchid fever have been given to the Victorian era's craze for collecting and discovering orchids. So in London, we have many interesting orchids. We have the bee orchids, which are called that way because the flowers resemble the furry bodies of bees and other insects. So here in the photo, we have the bee orchid itself, which you can find in calcareous grasslands in London. So on limestone or chalk, it's not too rare. It might possibly be increasing, and it reproduces through pseudocopulation. So the flowers mimic female insects to such a degree that males are fooled into mating with the flowers and thereby pollinating them. So this is fly orchid, which in the UK is only pollinated by 2 species of digger wasp, and it's less common than bee orchid, and it's considered vulnerable to extinction in London. Then the last one I'll show is autumn lady's tresses, which has spirally arranged flowers, as the scientific name suggests, and I photographed it in Box Hill, but it's been recorded in London as well, also on calcareous grasslands. So there are 21 native species of orchids in London overall, according to the checklist. But you can see that there are over 30,000 species globally. So the orchids are the 2nd largest plant family overall. And Mark and Paul's checklist for London included an additional 20 species, but these haven't been recorded since 2010. So that just shows the extent at which plants have gone extinct in London. So carrying on, the 3rd most tropical plant family in London is the coffee and cinchona family. So cinchona is the source of quinine that's been used as an anti-malarial, and that gives bitter taste to tonic water. But the Rubiaceae family in Britain and indeed in Europe is mostly associated to small herbs, and whereas in the tropics and in the family overall, it's mostly a family of woody plants and shrubs and trees, but also many climbers, and it's most diverse in wet tropical regions. So the one in the photo here is a Rothmania, which is a genus endemic to tropical Africa. It was photographed in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and you can see this very long corolla tube, which is presumably an adaptation for moth pollination. This one here was photographed in Belize. It's in the genus Palicorea, which is the 3rd largest genus in the family, with close to 700 species, all found in the Americas. And it has showy red bracts, which surrounds small congested flowers, and these are normally pollinated by hummingbirds. And then the last one I'll show for the tropics is Morinda, which is a common tropical seashore plant in South and Southeast Asia and also Australia. It's also naturalized in the American tropics, and the fruits are syncarp, so they're individual drupes, so fleshy fruits that fuse together in an overall structure. And the syncarp is smelly, but it is edible. And Morinda can grow to 9 meters tall. So in London, we have 12 native species, including all in 4 genera. First genus is Asperula with Squinancy wort. I don't know how you pronounce that. That's also found in calcareous grasslands and has very small flowers, but they're worth looking closely at because they have these pinkish veins. And there's crosswort, also on calcareous grasslands, called crosswort because the leaves form a cross. And then there's the bedstraws. So that's the largest native genus in London with 8 native species, according to the list. This is lady's bedstraw with yellow flowers. They're called bedstraws because they were used in the past to stuff mattresses. And the flowers of lady's bedstraw were also used to coagulate milk and cheese production. And the last native Rubiaceae genus in London is Sherrardia with field madder, very small flowers, quite common. You can also see this, you can even see this on sidewalks and base of street trees. And it's a monotypic genus, which means there's only one species in the genus, which was named after the English botanist William Sherrard. So Rubiaceae, again, a bit like the orchids, a very large plant family. This one is the fourth largest plant family overall with over 8,000 species. And yeah, it was striking when I first started working at the herbarium just to see how many Rubiaceae collections there were, because I was used to like the small galliums. I didn't realize just the extent at which this was a diverse family. So the fourth most tropical plant family in London, according to this analysis, is the soapberry family, Sapondaceae. It's a family of primarily trees, although the plant in the photo here is a slender climber. The fruit of this climber dehisces in 3 parts, which is quite common in the family. The family also has a lot of winged fruits. It was photographed in near Bangalore in India, but it's widely distributed in the tropics, that species. The soapberry family contains a lot of useful plants, a lot of edibles, including guarana, which is used as a stimulant in drinks, very popular in Brazil. And you can see the white fleshy aril surrounding the shiny seed. That's reminiscent of lychee, which belongs to the same plant family. And the arils of guarana are apparently also sweet and edible, but it's the seed that's used in the food industry. Here's another edible plant in the soapberry family, rambutan. Again, similar to lychee, it's the fleshy aril that surrounds the seed that's consumed, and apparently tastes like grape, although I've never tasted it. And in London, just one species, field maple, that's native. So maples used to be in their own family Aceraceae, but maples and horse chestnuts, which used to be in the family Hypocastanaceae, are now both included in the Sapondaceae family, because molecular evidence has revealed that they're all share a common ancestor and are monophyletic, so they form a clade together. So you might wonder why Norway maple or sycamore isn't mentioned, but they're currently classified as introduced species in Britain by the British Society of Britain and Ireland. So the theory is that the only native maple in Britain is field maple. And this photo provides a clear example of what's called a superior ovary, because we can see the fruit developing above the flower. So if I'd given this talk a few years ago, I wouldn't have mentioned maples because they were not. I wouldn't have mentioned maples because they're not included in the Sapondaceae. So I wouldn't have mentioned Sapondaceae. So just one native species, but a lot of introduced ones, including Pride of India, Colbertaria, and many maples that self-propagate in London. So Sapondaceae is the 46th largest plant family overall with close to 2,000 species. And okay, just 2 more plant families. So there are just 6 plant families in London that are over 75% tropical. So we've seen 4, and there's just 2 left. One of them is the pomegranate family, Lythraceae. And this is the first family we've encountered so far that's more diverse in the dry tropics than the wet tropics. The largest genus in the family is Caffeia, which you can see in the photo here, also known as cigar plants, with 250 species. This species is from Mexico, and if we were to look at it from the side, you'd see that it has a tubular corolla, which is why they're called cigar plants. Another member of that family is the apple mangrove, which is commonly found on seashores from East Africa to Southeast Asia and Australia. And the fruits that you can see here are sour, and they're used to flavor fish. Then Amania, which is the second largest genus in the family with over 100 species, is found in the dry tropics, but usually near water. So wetlands, marshes, swamps, along the edges of ponds, lakes, and slow-moving streams. So although it's a family that's more diversified in the dry tropics, they're still found near water. And in London, we just have one genus, Lythrum, with just two species. They're native water purslane, found in wet grasslands, quite rare in London, considered vulnerable to extinction. It was photographed here by Henry in Bushy Park with the seeds visible and the dehiscing capsule. And then we have the much more common purple loosestrife, which was photographed here by Mario, another member of LNHS near Kew Bridge. It's a common plant in London, especially on the edge of ponds and rivers. So Lythraceae, again, close to 2,000 species, 95th largest plant family. And so the last tropical plant family in London has over 75% of its species in the tropics is the ivy family, Rhamnaceae. So leaves in this family are usually large, have a palmate venation, and often compound. Here's another example of a palmate compound leaf, but it's completely divided at the base, so it looks like individual leaves. And that one's called the Australia umbrella tree. And it occurs in the north of Australia, but this one was photographed in New Guinea. And the genus, so Heptaplurum, used to be Schefflera, which was a very massive genus of over 600 species, was recently split. And there's only 13 species left in Schefflera, and most of them went to Heptaplurum. So Araliaceae are often tree-like. So we're used to ivy here, but in the tropics, they're mostly trees. And they typically have an unusual branching pattern with leaves clustered near the apex of the branches. And they tend to be found at higher elevations in the tropics. So in London, I already spoiled it by mentioning ivies. So we have two native ivy species, common ivy, which might be the only truly native ivy in London, which has whitish hairs. So hairs are looking at the hairs on ivy leaves is critical to identify the species. So in common ivy, the hairs are whitish, but some of the branches are pressed to the leaf surface, but some do stick out. Whereas in Atlantic ivy, which is more common on the west coast of Britain and Ireland and in London might have originated as a garden escape, the hairs are a bit more yellowish and the branches are mostly flush against the leaf surface. I find them tricky to tell apart, especially with the cultivated species as well. It's quite tricky. And then the third one, a bit more surprising, is pennywort. So they used to be in the umbellifer family, but molecular evidence has revealed that they're better placed in the ivy family. But both families are closely related, and that's visible in that the flowers, for example, are arranged in umbels in both the ivy family and umbellifers. So marsh pennywort is the only native species in London, but it's less common than the introduced floating pennywort, Hydrocotyl ranunculoides, which has deeper lobes in the leaves. So ivy family, 1.7 thousand species, that makes it the 52nd largest plant family overall. So only 6 tropical plant families in London which are over 75% tropical. So those are the ones I decided to showcase. I'll briefly mention some other tropical families that have between 50 and 75% of their species in the tropics overall. So here are 2 families that are most diverse in the dry tropics. Malvaceae, which are also very common in the wet tropics, but a bit more diversified in the dry tropics. So that's the cotton family, the cacao family, hibiscus family, and in London we have just 2 native genera, the mallows, Malva, and the lime trees, Tilia, which again used to be in their own family, Tiliaceae, but they're now in a subfamily in the family Malvaceae. And then the yam family, Dioscoriaceae, so adapted to the dry tropics with these underground storage organs, which are the yams, with 1 native species in London, black bryony, Dioscorea communis, which has fleshy fruits, whereas Dioscorea usually has wind dispersed fruits. Other noteworthy families. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, last slide for the native tropical plant families in London. Euphorbiaceae, that's a very large plant family. It has over 6.5 thousand species, which makes it the 8th largest plant family. Often they have latex, so that's the rubber tree family. There's also cassava, so edible plants. And there are 2 native genera and even just species in London. So there's Mercurialis, Mercurialis perennis, dog's mercury, on the top right, and wood spurge, Euphorbia amygdaloides. So all other Euphorbia species in London are apparently introduced. Then, yeah, so the nettle family, Urticaceae. So we think of them as herbs, but there are trees in the family. Here we have a Cecropia. Cecropia used to be in its own family. At some point, it was in the fig family, but it turns out that they're more closely related to nettles. And then the Cucurbitaceae family, the gourds, which are most diverse in the dry parts of Africa. They're typically climbers with tendrils and big fruits. And in London, we just have 1 native species, which has smaller fruits, white bryony, Bryonia cretica. All right. Next slide. Okay, so that was it. So here's a complete list of native tropical plant families in London, by decreasing percentage of species found in the tropics. I don't have time to cover the other ones. It's just worth mentioning perhaps the ferns. The world checklist that I used has an unconventional system for ferns. It has a very extended Polypodiaceae family concept where you have things like Dryopteris and an extended Aspleniaceae with things like Blechnum and all kinds of genera. But overall, ferns are more diverse. Most fern families are more diverse in the tropics. Right. So now I'm gonna ask you what you think are the plant families in London that are the most temperate. So those are plant families where the highest proportion of species are found only in temperate regions, not in the tropics. So yeah, feel free to post guesses in the chat. Give a few seconds and then see if you find the answer. Can't see the chat though. So if someone could read out loud some answers.
Yeah, Daniel, the first one that's come up from Richard is oaks.
Oaks, okay. Any others?
Tan suggested Asteraceae.
Uh-huh.
Now Katrina suggested ilex. Stuart suggested conifers. Maureen the ranunculates. Helen Apiaceae.
Yeah.
I apologize if I pronounce these incorrectly. I'm an entomologist.
Okay. Well, there we go. So by decreasing order of how temperate they are. So I heard Pinaceae, conifers. So they're in there. I heard the buttercups, ranunculaceae, 88%. So there is a bias towards herbaceous plants. The oaks, surprisingly, are about 50-50. They're very diverse in the subtropics, places like Mexico. Yeah, so there is a trend towards more herbaceous families, things like Saxifragaceae, Juncaceae, Liliaceae, Ranunculaceae, Pepaveraceae. And also there's an exception to what I said about ferns, because horsetails they're not ferns, proper ferns, but they're what's considered a fern ally family. They're more temperate, they're more diverse in temperate regions. So yeah, in terms of the pine family, I was surprised when I learned that there's only one species in the entire family that's considered native to Britain. That's Scots pine. Despite so many plants thriving in cultivation. So I guess has to do with geological history, with just the short amount of time since the last ice age and the physical isolation of Great Britain from mainland Europe since then. Yeah, so few key differences between temperate trees and tropical trees is that temperate trees are usually deciduous, so lose their leaves to better survive the winters. Also, the meristems, so the short stem cells where new growth is produced, they're protected by buds in the winter. More temperate trees are wind dispersed, so they tend to have catkins because it's useful for the trees to have dispersal before the leaves appear, and also it's still the cold months when insect activity is lower, so temperate trees tend to be more wind dispersed than tropical trees. And then when trees are evergreen, like in conifers, then the leaves have a reduced leaf surface and tend to form needles. All right, so the primary focus of the talk was on the native tropical plant families in London, but it's worth mentioning a few of the introduced plant families. So yeah, it's to put things in perspective, there are about 1.3 thousand, well, there's a little over 1,000 native species in London belonging to 98 families. Whereas there are over 2,000 self-spreading introduced species, so almost double. And they represent 133 families. So that includes 60 families that are exclusively represented by introduced species in London, and 35 of these are over 50% tropical overall. So I thought just briefly mention some of them. So that includes the passionflower family, mostly climbers with tendrils. So blue passionflower has been recorded as self-spreading in London. I don't think that's very common, but it can happen. So I'm mentioning it here. And then the Bignoniaceae family. So that's the catalpa family, which again is not a common sight as self-propagating, but has been recorded. And Bignoniaceae are mostly climbers in the tropics, and we do see some introduced climbers in London, like Campsis, something vine, can't remember. Yeah. Anyway, it's mostly a family of climbers. Yeah, so some of them are well established. Obviously, Tree of Heaven, which is invasive, quickly spreading. And Cimarubaceae is the smallest family I'll mention today because they're just over 100 species overall. And then Moraceae, so the fig family, larger family with over 1,000 species, mostly woody plants with latex, a lot of climbers. Yeah, any one of you who's cultivated a ficus plant indoors is very much aware of the latex. They tend to have complex compound fruits like figs, but also breadfruit, for example. So in London, fig, so Ficus carica, does seem to spread quite relatively easily. I've seen quite a few that I'm quite confident have appeared without human intervention. And there are also some records of black mulberry, Morus nigra, growing spontaneously in some spots of London, although I haven't seen that. Okay, so this is the, yeah, 750, yeah. So that's the last slide with plant photos before I wrap up with a few conclusions. So I thought I'd mention palms because they're a tropical icon, and 96% of the species are tropical. And like phoenix palms and, well, some palms can be seen quite commonly in London gardens, so they do survive the winters here. And the Chusan palm, which Trachycarpus, does self-propagate. We do sometimes see this form seedlings in London. Then I'm mentioning the mahogany family, Miliaceae, because that's 97% tropical. So this is the most tropical plant family overall that self-propagates in London. When I mentioned the native plant families with the arum family, that was closer to, I think it was 93%. So 97% is the most tropical plant family you can see that self-propagates in London. So the mahogany family has a lot of trees that are prized for their wood. And then the last one I'll mention is the avocado family, large family, which is also the bay family, which is commonly found growing wild in London. It's one of those Mediterranean evergreens, which seems to be very well adapted and doing increasingly well. Things with things like holm oak and Turkey oak. So no, Turkey oak's not evergreen, but yeah. Anyway, one of the evergreens that's doing increasingly well in London. All right, so here's the overall list of introduced tropical plant families in London. So that also includes the Anacardiaceae cashew family and the grapevine family Vitaceae. All right. Okay, so 5 minutes left. So we've explored the most tropical native and introduced plant families. Yeah, we've explored the most tropical families, but also the most temperate families. So let's broaden our perspective and consider London's overall plant diversity. So take a moment to think which plant families you think have the most native species in London overall. And I've heard some answers before that would apply here. So again, you can post your guesses in the chat.
Okay, Judy says palms. And there's a long pause. Ferns. Anchors resting Asteraceae again. And the Ranunculaceae have come up again twice. 2 votes for that.
Okay.
Asteraceae, so that's double vote. 3 votes for Asteraceae. Betula. Rhamnaceae from Maury. Rosacea. Anka said that she needs to consult her plant list, so she wants to cheat.
Well, there are several good answers there. Yeah.
And now got ivy's just come up again.
Okay. Well, so the answers, there they are. So Asteraceae was correct, Poaceae was correct, Rosaceae was correct. So that's the podium right there. That's helped a lot by these apomix, things like microspecies like rubus and Hieracium, Taraxacum. So yeah, Asteraceae number 1, grasses number 2, Rosaceae number 3, legumes 4. Surprised no one mentioned Lamiaceae or Brassicaceae, crucifers. So when we look at the top 20, there's just 2 tropical plant families, orchids and Rubiaceae. So the key takeaway here is that none of London's top 10 most species-rich families are predominantly tropical. And yeah, so we hadn't mentioned Asteraceae grasses or legumes so far, and that's because they're really well adapted to a wide range of environments. They're diversified both in the tropics and in temperate regions, so they don't have a strong bias towards either environment in terms of numbers of species. All right, and very last question. Globally, what are the plant families with the most species overall globally? I'll make it a bit shorter because running out of time, but just a few guesses perhaps.
I'd suggest orchids.
All right, I'll just
Silence on Poaceae, grasses, Asteraceae
okay.
come up.
All right.
Rosaceae with a query on that one.
Aha.
Rubiaceae,
Yeah.
Poaceae,
Yeah.
ferns.
All right.
I think that's it.
Yeah. So there we go. So Asteraceae takes the number 1 spot both in the global and London rankings. 30 over 36,000 species. So a lot of good answers there. I heard grasses again, orchids, Rubiaceae. So if those of you who are listening closely should have known that because I did mention that in the talk. So Asteraceae, Fabaceae legumes, Poaceae grasses, and Lamiaceae mints, Rosaceae roses, all in the top 10 of both the global and London lists. So actually, orchids are underrepresented in a sense in London. Euphorbiaceae definitely underrepresented compared to their global numbers. And Apocynaceae and Myrtaceae, very large families globally, very diverse in the tropics, but no native species in London or even Britain. Lesser periwinkle and Apocynaceae is an archaeophyte, which means it's been was introduced over 500 years ago. So it's quasi-native, but yeah, no native Apocynaceae or Myrtaceae. Although eucalyptus, let's hope it doesn't, but it could settle because it's really doing well in parts of Europe as a introduced species. All right, so that was the talk. So just a few summarizing remarks. So the majority of self-propagating plants in London belong to plant families that are not tropical. So either temperate, like buttercups, poppies, birches, or broadly distributed families like grasses and legumes. And orchids and Rubiaceae are the only tropical families to feature in the top 20 native plants in London. Yeah, so although there's a notable presence of native and introduced tropical species in London, there's no clear pattern suggesting that they might be more invasive. I mean, there's tree of heaven, but most invasive species in London, things like Japanese knotweed, giant hogweed, rhododendron, aquatics like New Zealand pygmyweed don't belong to tropical families. So I'm not sure there's any significant lesson to be drawn from this talk, but I hope it helps place the plants we see in London in a broader context and perhaps reflect on their distribution and evolutionary history. So yeah, just want to thank my colleague Saber Rockney for suggesting the possibility I give this talk. Mark Spencer and Paul Loss for sharing their work in progress list of London plants, and Maria Roberts for giving me the opportunity to give this talk and for doing such a wonderful job organizing it, and also the other organizers. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you ever so much, Daniel. I just think that analysis was so interesting, and kind of thinking about the flora of London in that global context and the connection between the plants that we see and the native, and also the kind of ones that have been introduced, and how they fit into a global picture. I found that really fascinating, and I thought the kind of way that you'd analysed that and thought about the families and classified them, I thought that was really, really interesting, and something quite different sort of approach, I think, to thinking about the flora. So that was fantastic. I also really liked the way that you kind of went through some of the adaptations that you'd see in tropical plants and in temperate plants. But it did strike me just how diverse these families are. So although they've got a kind of molecular connection, how that actually manifests in the kind of in their structure, the way that their growth form, even the kind of floral structure. It is very kind of complex to see the connection. And I hadn't realized about the duckweeds moving family, so I learned that as well. That was great. I'm going to I think we've got a lot of people saying thank you and really enjoyed the talk. I think we've just probably got a few minutes for a couple of questions, if that's all right.
I'll just stop the recording first before that happens.
Thank you.